Welcome, everybody. We are back again with another episode of Indie Reads Aloud. I'm having so much fun doing this podcast. This is now our second year doing this. We are well into the 130s now, which is super fun. And today we have returning author Rhys Shaw joining us again to read from her historical fiction series. Welcome back, Rhys.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy you're back. As I was telling you in the green room, I'm completely addicted. And just hearing the little bit I heard the last time you read, I decided I had to get your book. So I'm so excited to share your work with all of our listeners. It's very fun stuff. So those of you who did not hear Rhys's last reading, step number one, go back and listen to that. And step number two, let me tell you about Rhys. She's always been interested in history, dilapidated ruins, stories of deceit, and survival. Her belief that women are overlooked in history or blamed for mankind's unsavory decisions is the reigning theme behind her gritty, realistic historical fiction books. In the Welexia Series, Rhys draws upon her love of story to bring the pages alive with the personal struggles and pain of strong female characters, taking us on their journey to overcome and thrive. In the modern world, Rhys shares her home with a few furry friends and a less furry spouse. I love that phrase. She can often be found with her nose in a book or taking a walk, though not at the same time. And we've talked about that, and you're going to try it, aren't you?
I am going to try it.
I really think you should
find a field first, as per your advice.
Yeah, I suggest that novice walking, reading people avoid trees. So once you start doing it, you'll avoid the trees naturally. But when you're starting out, try an open field. For those of you today listening with little ears in the room, you might want to preview this episode before you share it with little people. This book has strong language and mature situations. It is historical fiction, and history is not always as beautiful as we imagine it would be. So, taking that into account, we do have a listener advisory for little ears. Tell me about book two. Now, book one just completely captivated me. And I'm so excited about these characters. I love reading about strong women, and the idea of reading about strong women in situations that usually they would be at a disadvantage, and your characters don't seem to have that problem here. So tell me a little bit about book two and where we are in in Ilaria's journey and how we go on to what comes next.
Okay. Thank you. So Ilaria, in the beginning of book two, after her family was freed from the dungeon in book one, her father decides to crown her queen. He thinks that she did such an amazing job keeping them alive, and he can see her leadership skills. So he wants to crown his daughter queen. And so this book, A Daughter Rules Owning Her Power, is really her. She was never expecting this. She's 17 years old now, and she's figuring it out. You know, she's observed her parents, but for 4 years in captivity, there really was nothing to observe as far as leadership goes. So the kingdom is a mess. There's a lot to sort out. She's a brand new queen. She's got to figure it all out. And her younger sister, who she kept alive, is jealous.
Sibling rivalry is always fun, no matter what century you drop it into.
Right. it exists, right? And so Ilaria's sister is called Soria, and unfortunately, because of her jealousy, she ends up walking away from a place where she would have been safe, and she's kidnapped. So the book two is Ilaria trying to get her sister back, you know, trying to find her, trying to get her back, trying to get the kingdom with food and the supplies that they need throughout, because the people were literally starving for 4 years.
So she has to be a leader and a humanitarian.
Yeah.
And for a 17-year-old, I would guess that's a pretty tall order.
Yeah. And it's not like today you can't pick up the phone and call somebody but,
Yeah. So let me ask you, does the king is the king there for counsel and advice, and is he helping her through this process, or is he
the
kind of abdicated and said, you know what, I don't have the energy for it anymore?
No, his intention is that they will rule side by side. He can draw on her ideas of, because he was so naive in book one. If he'd have listened to those around him, he would have realized that the kingdom was going to be overthrown.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
he's here, but he's very ill. The 4 years in captivity did not do him well. So his intention was to rule side by side. The reality is he's pretty much taken to his bed.
Got it. Okay, I
And
am really super stoked to hear you read.
okay,
I love your storytelling style, and it's just I'm
thank
very
you.
excited to have you. So when you are ready, please take the microphone and read
Okay,
aloud.
I'll just say that I'm going to jump to two sections. I'm going to have the first section, and then I'm going to jump to a section with Saria and her kidnapping. So,
Perfect. So we get two little snippets to enjoy today.
yeah,
Awesome.
thank you. So again, here's the book. It's what's behind me. Let me show it up in front of me so you can actually see it. Okay, and here we go. Thank you. Mid-morn was approaching, and the crowning ceremony would soon be taking place. Saria arrived along with some assistants to escort her older sister Ilaria to her chambers. Smiling at Ilaria, she said, "Come, sister, we need to ready you for the ceremony." The men all excused Ilaria. "When next we meet, you will be our queen," Bracknor said, bowing low. Ilaria smiled and dipped her chin, acknowledging his words. The sisters walked along the hallway holding hands, not speaking. Both were deep in thought and feeling many emotions. Ilaria was feeling fear and excitement of how her life was soon to change. She would be responsible for the safety and welfare of an entire kingdom of people. It was a bit overwhelming, but she reminded herself that she was a survivor and of all she had done to keep her family safe during their captivity. Saria was wondering what her role would be now that things were changing. She was pleased for Ilaria, of course. She had been the middle child until her sister Jennison had died a horrific death during their captivity. Now, being the youngest meant she was at the bottom of the heap when it came to decisions. At least that's how she felt. Trying to push her jealous feelings down, she motioned for Ilaria to enter the chamber. "We have gathered up much fabric and as many dresses as we could find for you. Let us choose one so we can make you up as queenly as possible." Ilaria wondered if she detected a note of sarcasm when her sister spoke. No, she thought, I am just being foolish. After all, we've been through so much together. Walking through the doorway, she dismissed these ridiculous thoughts. At last, midday arrived. The castle courtyard was filled with exuberant people. They were a raggedy-looking bunch, but the beams on their faces, the pride they felt in what they had achieved, and the hope of how their lives would change for the better was all that mattered. They had cleaned themselves up as much as possible. Someone had found a storage room filled with royal clothing from Traintor's family, which they had thrown out into the courtyard last night. Many of the villagers were wearing this finery. To look out over them, you'd see simple peasant clothing with a pop of extravagant fabric and color every now and then. A fancy hat topping off an outfit of a roughly hewn smock, a luxurious silk scarf tied around the waist of a plain woolen shift. It would have been comical if not for the pride upon their faces. A hush fell over the crowd. Trumpets blared. A royal procession where the people chose to and were not forced to attend had begun. King Ashenor walked out onto the balcony. He looked better than he had last night, but like many of the villagers, the hardships of the past 4 winters were showing. He walked a little less upright, and the lines upon his face were deeper than they remembered. He was as thin as they were, and they could tell he and his family had suffered. There was no separation of royalty and everyday people as far as that went. Bracknor followed behind him and stood to his left. Ashenor smiled warmly and looked around, taking in his ragtag subjects. "People of Welexia." He hung his head for a moment. Maintaining his composure was going to be difficult. The crowd remained silent, awaiting his next word. "Beautiful people of Welexia, first and foremost, I must thank you most sincerely. If not for you, my daughters and I would surely, well, I do not wish to think of that. You all came together, and now we are free. All of us are free." As he spoke the last line, he motioned with his open arms to embrace them all. The crowd erupted into cheers. There were tears of joy all around and disbelief that their suffering would be a thing of the past. Bracknor stepped forward and motioned for the crowd to settle down. Their excitement was palpable, and he smiled along with them. Once they'd quieted down, he stepped back and waited for King Ashnor to continue. Yes, we have much to celebrate. Let us not forget, our fight is not yet over. The tyrant from Newark, whose name I refuse to speak, will surely send some soldiers to attack when he hears the news. We have Bracknor here, who, along with many of you, will keep us safe. Now, I know why we are all gathered here today, but before I bring out my daughter, I would like to announce my surprise and officially appoint Bracknor as commander to the king's army. I can think of no man more worthy, more qualified than this position. He will be enlisting and training those who wish to become a guard or soldier, and you will be paid well for your service. Bracknor was taken aback, but refused to let on in front of his king and the villagers. He and Ashnor had not discussed this. Ashnor had no idea he was now married and soon to be a father. Bracknor had assumed he would be returning home to Dandy in a few weeks once he had organized everything at the castle. This was indeed a blow to him. Everyone was cheering and chanting his name, and Ashnor was smiling at him also. He bowed low and nodded. Inside, his stomach clenched. If he was honest with himself, this made perfect sense. He had not thought beyond a rescue and restoration of Ashnor to his throne. As far as Ashnor was concerned, Bracknor had always been his faithful servant, and he would simply continue on in that capacity. Composing himself, he alerted the trumpeters to begin playing again. As they did so, the crowd grew silent and watched as Ilaria walked out onto the balcony and stood to the right of her father, the king. She was not dressed extravagantly at all. Her dress was simple and plain, much to the disgust of Saria, who had tried to fancy her sister up. If you are to be our queen, you must look like one. I believe a queen should be known for how she rules her kingdom and not for her wardrobe, sister. I will agree to a brightly colored sash, but I would like to keep my look simple. Look at our people. They have suffered as we have. It does not feel right to flaunt myself in front of them. I will wear a simple dress. It would please me if you would arrange flowers in my hair as my crown. Saria pouted. You are always so practical. Fine, I'll do your hair. Now Saria saw how beautiful Ilaria looked in her simplicity. She was smiling on the outside, but inside she was seething. Secretly, she had hoped Ilaria's simple dress would make her look a fool to the people. Instead, it only made the villagers love her more. It was perfect for the occasion, after all they had been through. Saria felt overdressed now, as she herself had insisted on putting on the fanciest dress she could find. She slinked back inside the castle to find a place to sulk and then to change what she wore. She could hear the crowds cheering and laughing in the distance as she wandered through the empty castle corridors, feeling petulant. No doubt reacting to something her sister, their new queen, was saying, she surmised. Daydreaming and meandering, she found herself outside of the captive chamber. The door was wide open, and she walked in with trepidation and a hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach. She was struck by how it had remained just as they left it last night. Their escape had been so sudden. Nothing had been disturbed. Her pigments and artwork were still upon the easel. Her educational books that Ilaria had bargained for were on the table, awaiting a lesson to be resumed. Their food, water, ablution, and cleansing buckets were in their appropriate places. As their father had been their cellmate, Ilaria had enlisted Saria's help in making a screen of sorts to place in front of their ablution and cleansing buckets to offer some privacy. Ilaria had been the one to keep them alive when death seemed imminent. She had made a deal with Banton, and they were moved from the dungeon to this room. Her mother and younger sister were gone, and she knew that, if not for Ilaria, they would have followed them in crossing that threshold. At 15, it was childish to feel jealous of her sister, but she couldn't help herself. Hearing hushed voices out in the hallway brought her back from her wandering thoughts. Everyone was outside in the courtyard listening to the king and queen. Why would anyone be skulking around the castle? Her survival instincts kicked in, and she hid behind the privacy screen, trying to quiet her breathing. Someone entered. They were rifling through everything. After a time, she heard them speaking with a second person. Both voices sounded familiar. Whoosh, the screen was knocked over and she stood there face to face with Blinken and Banton. Her first reaction was to scream, which Banton anticipated. He lunged for her, knocking the buckets over. They were both slipping and trying to stay upright when Blinken hissed, "Keep her quiet! We don't want anyone coming!" Banton grabbed her, pulling her arm behind her back and slapping his hand over her mouth. "Ah, so we lost your sister, but we have you. Even better because you're younger." Her eyes went wide as she began to grasp what he meant by this. Remembering what her sister had told her last night just before their rescue, she was terrified and began to cry. Surely this wasn't happening. She'd been out of her prison cell for less than a full day and wondered what was to become of her. Blinken stepped out in the hallway. "Come on, it's clear. Let's get out of here." After securing a gag around Saria's mouth so she could not scream and tying her hands in front of her, Banton yanked her out into the hallway. He pulled her along as Blinken led the way. In the distance, she heard her father proclaim, "Now, let us eat, dance, and celebrate to our new queen, Queen Ilaria of Welexia." Uproarious cheering ensued. Now we're deep into the captivity. Each day passed by much the same as the previous one. Wake up with the sun, eat, take care of morning ablutions, ride on, stop around midday, maybe cook a rabbit, squirrel, or other small critter that Banton managed to kill, fill the water pouches whenever possible, ride on until the sun began to fade, set up camp, sleep, repeat. Because of the monotony, Saria lost track of how many nights they'd been together. She had finally convinced Banton to untie her hands when she was eating and squatting, but he retied them when they slept and rode. She was sure she had calluses on her hind quarters and, due to her captivity, could easily imagine how disheveled she must look. Banton insisted she wash her face and hands whenever they were near water, but as far as any other bathing went, he said they would wait until they reached the port. There, he promised her a hot bath and a fresh dress. The woolen dress he made her wear was causing her skin to break out in hives, and without being able to itch when her hands were tied, it nearly drove her crazy. As soon as he untied her, she would begin scratching her arms and legs. He would reprimand her and threaten to immediately tie her up again unless she stopped. Her eating had resumed because she no longer cared about being watched while she eliminated and knew she needed her strength if she had any chance of ever escaping. Although Banton enforced his rule of her never speaking when on the road, she tried to prise information out of him about his childhood and where he grew up. She hoped by doing so that he could one day be captured. He was very tight-lipped and might answer a few of her questions, but then would tell her to stop asking and remind her they were not friends, merely business partners. One night she said, "How can we be business partners when I am the one bringing all of the value and will receive none of the profit?" "Princess, how can you say that? I feed you, I look after you, keeping you safe on these dangerous roads. You will not receive any of the gold that I do, of course, but you will have gained experience in the ways of the world, and especially in the ways of all things carnal. That is an education that many never receive. Royalty are never educated in the ways of the common man." "Are you serious? You know how I have been living. I experienced only one night of freedom and then became your prisoner. I have not had it as easy as you have over the last 4 winters. You are the one who is out of touch. I despise you. Do not ever believe we are partners in anything." She wanted to scream and cry, but did not want him to see how vulnerable she was feeling, so she hurried over to the area preparing for sleeping and lay down, tightly closing her eyes. After a few minutes, Banton approached her and knelt in front of her until she put her hands together so he could tie them. Then he stepped over her, urinated not nearly far enough away, and lay down behind her, again reaching around to tie a rope from her hands to his waist so she could not run off during the night. Saria slept fitfully that night under the full moon and was still angry in the morning when she opened her eyes to see that this was indeed her reality and not a nightmare as she dreamt it was. Banton was already up and had everything packed and ready to go. "Ah, there she is, my partner." He drew out the last word to spite her. "We need to get going. Here's some dried meat. Eat up, piss, shite, whatever, just hurry." She put her hands out to have them untied. "Nah, I don't think we will bother with nicety anymore. You can do everything you need to do with them bound." Then he turned away to tie their sleeping blanket onto the horse. A severe cramp caused her to double over, and she squatted to discover she was flowing heavily. It was all down the inside of her legs and had even managed to soak through her dress. At the same time, Banton was rolling up the blanket and realized it, too, was covered in blood. Ah, for feck's sake, not this shite again. He hung his head in exasperation. Saria remained squatting, knowing she needed some sort of rag in place and that she also needed to cleanse herself. She was so furious with him for putting her in this situation, so she chose to do nothing to help. Let him figure it all out, she thought. With that, she plopped down on the ground, directly on top of her urine and blood, and looked at him with defiance. Never had she loathed anyone as much as this man. She was not sure how wise her decision was when he stood her up and walked her towards a strong tree, forcing her to sit there before untying her front-bound hands and stretching each arm behind her, going around the tree trunk. He then retied the rope from one wrist, looped it back around the tree, and tied it to the other wrist. Her shoulders began aching as the circulation in her arms slowed down. He placed a gag in her mouth and tied another around her head to keep it in place, as he had done when smuggling her out of the castle. He stood back and admired his work. We are very near the port. Here you will sit whilst I go into the village and find us a room to stay in until your suitor, our paying customer, arrives. I will return for you, and we will go in when it is dark, so no one can see what an awful state you've gotten yourself into. He mounted his horse and led the other away with him. Just to rub salt in the wounds, he hollered back to her. I'll be back. Don't go anywhere. She was livid, too angry to cry. Why should she be punished for something so natural? Men were fools. The way they treated women when it was their time to flower, they seemed equally repulsed and fearful. Perhaps this womanly curse would buy her more time. If the disgusting suitor arrived and Banton told him she was having her menses, he may wish to wait, thus giving her more time to plan an escape. She thanked the goddesses for their gift of womanhood and felt a calmness come over her. After the restless night she'd had, closing her eyes and leaning her head against the smooth bark, it only took a moment for her to fall asleep.
Wow. Nothing like dropping us directly into the adventure. It's very fun. Oh my gosh. In imagining the kingdom of Welexia, lots of different visions come into my head. Did you have a particular geography in mind when you started writing these books?
It's European, for sure. I think when we think of castles, we probably automatically think of that.
Right.
I drew, not very well, but I drew a map of Welexia and placed the port and the castle and some of the villages I've had. And then there are other kingdoms as well. It's one of 7 kingdoms. We only touch on 2 more in the series, really. We send word to the others occasionally, but only 2 are very prominent. Restunia being the one that's really going to pop up in this book as well. So geographically, it's forest, it's European. I created it in my mind, but I left, even with my characters, I give some very minimal descriptions because I want people to see what they see.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really fun because as I'm listening to you read, you have such a great reading voice.
Thank you.
It's so transformative. I find myself falling into the story so easily just listening to your voice. And so I have little pieces of Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis and there's a little bit of Russian influence coming into it because of the whole, overflowing the king or the czar, however you want to name him, right? So it's really interesting to hear how you've intersected all of those things together. Did you do that purposefully? Did you draw on those influences? For instance, so Margaret Atwood, when she talks about The Handmaid's Tale, says, I didn't write anything that wasn't already true at one time or another. So I'm wondering, did you draw for your stories on true incidents of history and then you augmented, or is this all pure imagination for you?
No, yes and no. Some of this is true things that have happened in history. It's funny that you mentioned Russia because Restunia is my Russia that I wrote about.
Okay.
Not very clever, Restunia, Russia, but it's a stretch. But as far as the kingdom is divided, there are the followers of Traintor, there are the followers of Ashnor, and that's pretty prevalent in the United States right now. We are a very
Yeah,
divided country. So I did draw upon things happening in the current political situation that we live in, as well as, you know, kingdoms are often overthrown. They have been throughout time.
sure.
Different people want the power, don't they?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a combination, really.
That's very cool. I'm so excited about reading these books, and I love that you agreed to do the program. I'm so grateful. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. I have so much fun doing this, and the people that were able to listen to the last one that you and I did, you know, they're just like, "Wow, that was so fun!" And I said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And I think it's just great what you're doing. I love it.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to having you back for book 3. I think that's going to be super fun. I'd like to, like I say, getting these little snippets of all the books just increases my literary salvatory glands, right? Like I really, really want these now.
Well, thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you
I'm glad.
so much. And I look forward to having you back.
All right. Thank you, Diana.